Herrero and Namaka Genocide, 1904 to 1908. So, Germany was feeling left out of the colonial power struggle that was happening in the 1900s. So, well, they decided to grab a slice for themselves by any means necessary, and with this, they set their sights on Southwest Africa, home of the Herrero and Namaka tribes. At first, it was all polite-ish exchanges, but soon it was clear that the Germans were less about making friends and more about taking land. Well, once the tribes realized that the Germans were stealing their lands, cattle, and freedom, they revolted against the German colonizers in 1904. This was like David versus Goliath, except David didn't have a slingshot, just a lot of determination and a few spears. However, things quickly took a turn for the worst when General Lothar von Trotha was sent by the Germans to handle the situation. And by handle, I mean unleash a campaign of brutal extermination. Von Trotha wasn't about negotiation. He was all about making sure there were no Herrero or Namaka left to argue. In what has to be one of the darkest plot twists in history, von Trotha issued an extermination order declaring that every Herrero man, woman, and child should be killed. Those who weren't killed immediately were driven into the desert to die of thirst and starvation. Von Trotha's idea of diplomacy was basically, if you find Herrero, you shoot. If they run, you shoot. If they surrender, well, you still shoot. Not exactly the peace talks you'd hope for. Now, out of an estimated 80,000 Herrero, about 65,000 were killed. The Namaka didn't fare much better. Around 10,000 of their population perished. That's 75,000 lives lost in a calculated act of genocide. It literally got so bad that even guys in the early 20th century who were not exactly a beacon of human rights literally had to step in for Germany to stop. International outcry grew, and eventually the extermination orders were rescinded. By then, the damage was done. Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1923. So, it's the 20th century and, well, the world is just starting to grapple with modernity. But now, the Armenians, a Christian minority living under Ottoman rule, were about to face something that even medieval torturers would consider an abomination. You see, the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, were like the brainy kids in class who also made the best cookies. They were educated, successful, and often involved in trade and politics. But the Ottoman rulers, particularly during the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and later under the Young Turks, weren't fans of this upward mobility. So, by 1915, during World War I, the Ottoman Empire had suffered a lot of loss and was a sinking ship. So the Young Turks, a nationalist movement, took power and decided that the best way to save the ship was to throw overboard anyone they didn't trust. And, well, Armenians were the unfortunate scapegoats. And so on April 24th, 1915, Armenian intellectuals and leaders were rounded up in Constantinople and murdered in cold blood. This day is often considered the start of the Armenian Genocide. What followed was a systematic attempt to eradicate the Armenian people through mass deportations, forced marches through the Syrian desert, where many died of starvation, dehydration, exposure, and outright massacres. Imagine being told to pack your bags for a nice walk only to find out that it's a one-way ticket to nowhere with no provisions and a lot of angry guards. Over the course of these brutal years, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians were killed. Families were torn apart, entire villages were wiped out, and a rich cultural heritage was nearly erased. This was not just a case of political disagreement. It was genocide, plain and simple. Bangladesh Genocide, 1971. If you've ever been in a relationship that was so toxic and the separation even worse, then you might have a little bit of understanding as to why this horrific event ever happened. It all started because East Pakistan had long felt like the neglected child in the family that was sidelined and overlooked by the dominant West Pakistan, which is now known as Pakistan. The cultural, linguistic, and economic differences were vast, and East Pakistan was tired of playing second fiddle. So, when Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won the majority of the 1970 elections, the East guys were overjoyed. But then, West Pakistan wasn't about to hand over the mic, and led by General Yahya Khan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, these guys decided to crash the party in the worst way possible. What followed was Operation Searchlight, a military crackdown on March 25, 1971 that aimed to silence the independence movement. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for anyone, especially the innocent civilians. And from March to December 1971, the Pakistani military and their local collaborators unleashed a campaign of mass murder, rape, and destruction. The death toll is estimated between 300,000 to 3 million people. Now, if you think your breakup was bad, this one came with military crackdowns and mass atrocities. The goal was to crush the Bengali nationalist movement, but what they did was create a humanitarian disaster. Thankfully, despite the unimaginable horrors, the people of East Pakistan fought back. With the help of India, which intervened after millions of refugees flooded across its borders, the Bangladesh Liberation War culminated in victory on December 16, 1971. Holocaust, 1941 to 1945. Let's just imagine for a second that you're chilling in your room, eating pizza and drinking wine when you switch on the TV and see a headline from 1941. Madman with a mustache declares war on humanity. You'll probably be thinking it's some sort of joke, but this was as real as a heart attack back then, and it was courtesy of a man named Adolf Hitler, the guy who made villains in comic books look like amateurs. It all started in Germany in 1933, when times were tough and people were really going through it. Then along came Hitler, promising to make Germany great again. Sounds familiar? Well, instead of building walls, he built gas chambers, blamed the Jews for all of Germany's problems, and decided that the best way to fix everything was to exterminate them. Logical, right? Well, it gets way worse, because Hitler's Nazi party didn't just dislike Jewish people, they had a whole vendetta against them and began a campaign of terror that escalated into one of the worst genocides in history. First, the Nazis made it legal to discriminate against Jews. They couldn't marry Aryans or even wave at them without getting into trouble. Basically, if you were Jewish, life was harder than explaining quantum physics to a toddler. Next, the Jews were forced into overcrowded ghettos and concentration camps, with the most infamous being Auschwitz. These camps were less about camping and more about forced labor, starvation, and cruel experiments. It was honestly hell on earth. Finally, when the Nazis got tired of beating around the bush, they launched the final solution in 1942, which included wiping out the entire Jewish population in gas chambers. Millions were killed in a systematic, industrialized manner, which, if you think about it, is the darkest example of German efficiency. In total, about 6 million Jews were killed. To put that into perspective, that's like wiping out the entire population of New Zealand today, twice. And that's just the Jewish victims. Overall, the Nazis' genocidal policies led to the deaths of around 11 million people. Cambodian Genocide, 1975 to 1979. Imagine waking up one day in 1975 Cambodia, expecting your usual bowl of rice and maybe some morning gossip about the neighbor's cow, only to find yourself in a dystopian nightmare orchestrated by a man who apparently thought fun meant turning his country into a giant deadly game of Who's the Revolutionary? This was the twisted reality under Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime. You see, Pol Pot was a man who believed Cambodia needed a full-on radical agrarian utopia reboot. His great vision of change was that everyone would work in rice fields and anyone who disagreed would face a less than pleasant fate. So on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge, led by none other than Pol Pot, rolled into Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital, like it was a hostile corporate takeover. The city's 2 million inhabitants were marched out to the countryside with promises of fresh air and freedom from the hustle and bustle, except it was more about hard labor. The worst part is that Pol Pot wasn't into half measures, so he abolished money, schools, private property, and even families. Intellectuals, professionals, and even people wearing glasses, because clearly glasses meant you read books, and reading was suspicious and seen as threats and eliminated. His policies led to forced labor, starvation, and executions on a massive scale. The grim reality was that between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people perished. That's about a quarter of Cambodia's population gone due to execution, starvation, disease, and overwork. Thankfully, Pol Pot's reign ended in 1979 when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and put a stop to the horror show. Pol Pot fled to the jungle, living a life of isolation and eventually dying in 1998. Rwandan Genocide, 1994. From the start, Rwanda was home to two major ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and these guys had lived together for centuries in peace, but there was one little hitch. When colonial powers came into play, they started to favor the Tutsi over the Hutu, and this put the Tutsis in power for many years, and, well, this made the Hutus feel like the understudy who never got the lead role. The worst part was that the Hutus made up about 85% of the population, and the Tutsis about 15%. It's like choosing your favorite sibling and then watching the other get increasingly annoyed over the years. Eventually, things boiled over on April 6, 1994, when the plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, was shot down. It's still a whodunit mystery, but this event was the spark that ignited a genocide. Hutu extremists blamed the Tutsis faster than you can say whodunit and took revenge into their own hands. Armed with machetes, clubs, and whatever they could get their hands on, Hutu militias, including the infamous Interahamwe, went on a killing spree. And they weren't picky. If you were a Tutsi or a Hutu opposing the madness, you were a target. Friends turned on friends and neighbors turned on neighbors. It was like the worst neighborhood watch ever. In just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed. To put that in perspective, that's about 8,000 lives per day. It was like a tragic, non-stop marathon of violence. Sadly, after the genocide, Rwanda was left in ruins, both physically and emotionally. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, led by Paul Kagame, finally seized control in July 1994, ending the genocide. But the road to healing was like trying to glue back a shattered face. Painstaking and slow. Thousands of perpetrators were tried in traditional Gacaca courts where communities faced their demons, and believe it or not, many survivors chose forgiveness over vengeance. If that's not the ultimate plot twist, I don't know what is. Bosnian Genocide, 1992 to 1995. So you see, Bosnia, a part of the former Yugoslavia, was a land of diversity, a lovely blend of Bosniaks, aka Muslims, Croats, aka Catholics, and Serbs, who were the Orthodox Christians. Picture it as a Balkan stew that's spicy, diverse, and full of flavors. However, this culinary delight of cultures soured when Yugoslavia fell apart and nationalism reared its ugly head like an unwelcome party guest. Basically, as Yugoslavia disintegrated, Bosnia declared independence in 1992, and this included the Bosnian Serbs, led by the not-so-neighborly Radovan Karadzic and his military pal Radko Mladic. And, well, their goal was to apparently carve out a greater Serbia, which essentially meant, let's get rid of anyone who isn't us. They weren't exactly subtle about it either, and using ethnic cleansing as their main strategy. The ethnic cleansing basically meant killing, torturing, or forcibly displacing Bosnians and Croats. Towns were raided, homes were destroyed, and countless atrocities were committed. The most infamous chapter of this dark saga is the Srebrenica massacre in July 1995, where over 8,000 Bosnian men and boys were killed in what was supposed to be a UN-protected safe zone. It was like running to a safety shelter only to find it's more like the world's worst escape room. By the end of this horrific ordeal, over 100,000 people had been killed, with countless others displaced or missing. It wasn't just the body count that left a scar, it was the deep wounds in the collective soul of Bosnia that would take generations to heal. Chinese Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Imagine you're a teenager in 1996 living in a quiet Chinese village. Life's pretty mundane. School, chores, the occasional friendship drama. When your peaceful life is suddenly flipped upside down because the country's leader, Mao Zedong, has decided it's time to shake things up in the most dramatic, life-altering way possible. You can think of Mao as the ultimate drama king because the entire time he was ruler, it was just one problem after another. And by the mid-1960s, Mao was feeling sidelined. His previous policies, like the Great Leap Forward, hadn't exactly gone well, so of course people were starting to question his leadership. Well, ever-dramatic Mao didn't appreciate this, so he decided that the best course of action would be to stage a comeback with an epic purge of culture. To put it bluntly, this guy decided that the whole of China needed a cultural cleansing to rid the country of old customs, habits, ideas, and culture. Basically, anything that smelled even remotely like tradition or intellectualism. Then he recruited teenagers who he named Red Guards, and they were given free rein to question, humiliate, and sometimes even beat up teachers, intellectuals, and anyone they deemed a counter-revolutionary. Suddenly, kids had more power than your average principal on a bad day. Just imagine how chaotic that was. The Red Guards went on a rampage, burning books, smashing ancient artifacts, and renaming everything. Seriously, even street signs weren't safe. Sadly, a lot of people lost their lives in the so-called cultural cleansing, and an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people were killed, and millions more were tortured, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. Families were torn apart, careers destroyed, and entire communities plunged into poverty and despair, all because one man couldn't take constructive criticism very well. Stalin's purges, 1936 to 1938. You've probably heard about the Stalin Purge, which is popularly known in history as the Great Purge or Great Terror. During this time, Joseph Stalin, the man with a mustache more iconic than any dictator should have, decided that anyone who even remotely looked at him funny might be plotting against him. This wasn't your regular delete your ex's number kind of paranoia. Stalin wanted to purge his political enemies, real or imagined. And the saddest part is that most were actually imagined. Plus, Stalin didn't just stop at his political rivals. He went all in, so military leaders, intellectuals, peasants, and even his old Bolshevik comrades were either executed, sent to the infamous Gulag labor camps, or disappeared in the middle of the night. Because when Stalin said, "You're dead to me," he meant it literally. In fact, Stalin purged 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 5 army commanders, and 8 out of 9 admirals. I mean, when your army's chain of command has more vacancies than a haunted hotel, you know things have gotten out of hand. Between 1936 and 1938, an estimated 600,000 to 1.2 million people were executed, with millions more sent to labor camps where death was a likely outcome. To put that in perspective, that's more people than there are penguins in Antarctica. Darfur Genocide, 2003 to present. So, here's the backstory of how this nightmare began. Basically, Darfur is a region about the size of Texas, home to a mix of ethnic groups, but mainly non-Arab farmers and Arab nomads. However, just like any country with different cultures and religions, tension started to develop between these groups, but it wasn't serious yet. But then, in 2003, that itch turned into a raging fire when rebel groups accused the Sudanese government of favoring Arabs over non-Arabs, which is like accusing your mom of giving your sibling more ice cream, but a million times worse. Well, the rebels had had enough, so they launched attacks against the government. And well, the government responded by equally unleashing the Janjaweed, a militia so infamous they made movie villains look like puppies. And these guys had just one mission: eradicate the rebels. And the preferred method of eradication? You guessed it. Genocide. The Janjaweed, whose names actually translates to devils on horseback, which sounds like something straight out of a post-apocalyptic novel, didn't just aim to defeat, they aimed to obliterate. Think Thanos, but without the cool CGI. So, from 2003 onward, Darfur became the setting for one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. The Janjaweed militia went on a killing spree that would make a horror movie director cringe. Villages were burned, people were massacred, and women were subjected to unspeakable atrocities. The UN estimates around 300,000 people were killed, though some argue the number could be much higher. Guatemalan Genocide, 1981 to 1983. Guatemala in the late 20th century was a bit like a soap opera, minus the fun, romance, and happy endings. The country was embroiled in a civil war that had been simmering since 1960. On one side, the government and its military forces, on the other, leftist guerrillas. In the middle were indigenous Maya people who, quite frankly, were just trying to live their lives without getting caught in the crossfire. But then, a man named General Efrain Rios Monat came into the picture and decided that he would rather just obliterate anyone who looked like the guerrilla insurgency instead of fighting them directly. That's like deciding to kill anything that crawls on all fours just because you hate rats. Well, that's obviously very flawed thinking, but his military guys didn't have any problems with it. So it began. And between 1981 and 1983, the Guatemalan military launched scorched earth campaigns, destroying over 600 villages, killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. The total number of people killed was a staggering 200,000, with the vast majority being indigenous Maya. What made this evil so wrong was that the genocide wasn't just about the number of people killed, it was about the systematic destruction of a culture. The military didn't just target individuals, they aimed to erase entire communities. Villages were razed, crops were burned, and the survivors were left to grapple with unimaginable loss. Government's logic was a twisted version of, if you can't beat them, destroy everything they've ever loved. The saddest part in all these is that for years, the Guatemalan government denied any wrongdoing. It wasn't until 2013 that Rios Monat was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity.